Man saves a drowning bear cub. What happened next shocked his entire town. The fog hung thick over Cedar Lake that morning, as it often did in early September when the first whispers of autumn began to creep through the Montana mountains. Tom Henderson sat in his small wooden boat, the rhythmic motion of the water beneath him providing a familiar comfort. At 72, his hands were weathered and spotted with age, but they still moved with practiced precision as he cast his line into the misty waters. 3 years had passed since Margaret's death, but the weight of her absence still pressed against his chest each morning when he woke to an empty bed. 47 years of marriage had intertwined their lives so completely that sometimes Tom still turned to share a thought with her, only to be met with silence. Fishing had become his refuge, a place where the quiet felt natural rather than oppressive. The mountains surrounding Cedar Lake stood like silent sentinels, their peaks disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. Tom had known these waters since childhood, back when his father would take him out at dawn in this very same boat. Now, decades later, he found himself returning day after day, not so much for the fish as for the peace. He was about to cast again when he heard it, a splashing sound, different from the gentle lapping of the lake against his boat. Then came a sound that made his heart quicken, a desperate, frightened whimpering that carried across the water. Tom immediately thought of the Andersons' golden retriever that had gone missing last week. Without hesitation, he began rowing toward the sound, the boat cutting through the fog like a ghost ship. "Hold on there," he called out, his voice echoing across the water. "I'm coming." As he drew closer, the splashing became more frantic. Tom squinted through the fog, expecting to see the golden fur of the Andersons' dog. Instead, as the mist parted, his breath caught in his throat. There, thrashing in the water, was a small black bear cub, its paws hopelessly entangled in an old fishing net that some careless angler had abandoned. The cub's head barely remained above water, its eyes wide with terror. Tom's military training kicked in immediately, assessed the situation, determined the risk, take action. The cub was young, probably about 5 or 6 months old, and clearly exhausted from struggling. Its mother was nowhere to be seen, which concerned Tom. Bear cubs typically stayed with their mothers for at least 2 years. This little one was either orphaned or had somehow become separated. "Easy there," Tom murmured, though he knew the frightened animal couldn't understand him. He maneuvered his boat closer, careful not to startle the cub further. The bear let out another whimper, weaker this time, its struggles becoming less vigorous as exhaustion took hold. Tom knew the risks. Even a young bear could be dangerous, particularly one in distress. But something in those frightened eyes reminded him of the wounded look he'd seen too many times during his tours in Vietnam, the universal expression of a creature facing death and desperately clinging to life. With a deep breath, Tom secured his boat and slipped into the cold water. The shock of it made his old joints protest, but he pushed forward, reaching into his pocket for the folding knife he always carried. The bear's eyes followed his movements, but it seemed too weak to put up much of a fight now. "I'm going to help you," Tom said in the same calm, deep voice he had once used to reassure young soldiers under his command. "Just stay still for me." As if understanding, the cub's thrashing subsided slightly. Tom began carefully cutting away the tangled net, working methodically to avoid accidentally cutting the animal. The cub occasionally panicked, its claws catching Tom's forearm and leaving shallow scratches, but he continued speaking in that steady, soothing tone. "Almost there, little one. Just a bit more." The water was numbingly cold, and Tom's fingers began to lose feeling, making the delicate work of cutting the net more difficult. But at last, with one final slice, the net fell away. The cub, suddenly free, made a weak attempt to swim, but its strength was clearly spent. Without thinking, Tom gathered the small bear in his arms, surprised at how light it felt despite its sodden fur. "Let's get you to shore," he murmured, swimming awkwardly back to his boat with one arm while holding the cub above water with the other. Getting both himself and the bear into the boat proved challenging, but Tom managed it with the stubborn determination that had seen him through 2 wars and the long, painful months of Margaret's illness. The cub lay in the bottom of the boat, shivering violently, its breathing labored and wheezing. Tom rowed to shore with powerful strokes, his mind racing. The bear needed warmth, and quickly. He couldn't take it to the local vet. Doc Weston was skilled with farm animals and pets but had no experience with wildlife. The nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was over 100 miles away, and in the cub's current state, Tom doubted it would survive the journey. That left only one option. As he reached the shore and carefully lifted the trembling cub from the boat, Tom made his decision. He would take it home, at least until it was stable enough to be transported elsewhere. The walk back to his cabin took longer than usual, burdened as he was with his fishing gear and the waterlogged bear. The cub had stopped struggling entirely, which worried Tom more than its earlier thrashing. By the time he pushed open his front door with his shoulder, the animal's eyes were half closed, and its shivering had intensified. Tom's cabin was modest but comfortable, a testament to Margaret's touch still visible in the handmade quilts draped over the furniture and the watercolor landscapes hanging on the pine walls. He laid the cub gently on the braided rug before the fireplace and quickly set about building a fire. Once the flames were crackling, he wrapped the bear in several old blankets and positioned it close enough to benefit from the warmth without risking overheating. "You're a miracle, you know that," Tom said softly as he rubbed the cub dry with a towel. "By all rights, you should be at the bottom of that lake." The bear's eyes, golden brown and intelligent, fixed on Tom's face as if studying him. There was something in that gaze, a kind of ancient wisdom that seemed at odds with the animal's youth, that made Tom's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Mira," he said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you. It means miracle in some language or other." Margaret would have known which one. She had been the educated one in their marriage, always reading and learning. Tom had been the practical one, fixing what was broken, building what was needed. As night fell, Tom maintained his vigil by the fire, occasionally adding another log to keep the flames high. He had cleaned and bandaged the scratches on his arm, superficial wounds that required little attention. More concerning was Mira's condition. Her breathing remained labored, each inhale accompanied by a faint wheezing sound that Tom didn't like. He tried to get her to drink some water from a shallow bowl, but she showed little interest. When he offered some leftover chicken from his refrigerator, however, her nostrils flared, and she managed to eat a few small pieces before exhaustion overcame her again. As Mira's breathing grew more strained in the early hours of the morning, Tom found himself transported back to another time and place, to a rain-soaked jungle where he had held his best friend, Jimmy Pearson, as he struggled for each breath, blood bubbling from the bullet wound in his chest. Jimmy had looked up at Tom with the same trust he now saw in Mira's eyes, the absolute belief that Tom could somehow make everything right. He hadn't been able to save Jimmy. The memory of his friend's final shuddering breath had haunted Tom for decades, surfacing in nightmares that left him sweat-soaked and trembling. "Not this time," Tom whispered fiercely to Mira, gently stroking her damp fur. "You're going to make it. Whether it was Tom's determination or simply the bear's natural resilience, Mira's breathing gradually eased. As dawn approached, the wheezing subsided, and her shivering stopped as her body temperature normalized. By morning, she was able to drink water on her own and devoured the remaining chicken Tom offered. Tom knew he should contact the wildlife authorities. Keeping a wild bear, even an orphaned cub, was illegal. But as he watched Mira cautiously exploring the living room, occasionally glancing back at him as if for reassurance, he couldn't bring himself to make the call just yet. One more day, he told himself, just to make sure she's strong enough for the journey. One day stretched into 2, then 3. Mira's recovery was remarkable. By the 4th day, she was playing with an old rubber ball that had belonged to a dog Tom and Margaret had owned years ago, batting it around the cabin with surprising dexterity. What struck Tom most, however, was her gentleness. Despite being a wild animal, she showed no aggression toward him. On the contrary, she seemed to seek out his company, often settling beside his armchair and resting her head on his leg while he read at night. She would make soft grunting sounds that Tom swore sounded almost like purring as she curled up on the rug beside his bed. Sometimes when the nightmares came, Jimmy's face, Margaret's final days in the hospital, Tom would wake to find Mira watching him, her golden eyes reflecting the moonlight streaming through the window. On those nights, he would reach down and place his hand on her head, and the simple contact would ground him, pulling him back from the edge of despair. "You're supposed to be comforting me," Tom would murmur with a wry smile, not the other way around. As the days passed, Tom found himself talking to Mira more and more. He told her about Margaret, how they had met at a county fair when they were both 18, how she had taught 2nd grade for 40 years, how brave she had been during her battle with cancer. He told her about his time in the service, stories he had never shared with anyone, not even Margaret. There was something freeing about speaking these truths to a creature who couldn't judge or pity him. Tom knew he couldn't keep Mira forever. She was growing rapidly, already twice the size she had been when he pulled her from the lake. He converted his toolshed into a makeshift enclosure for her, lining it with straw and installing a small heater for the increasingly cold nights. He began researching bear dietetics, ordering books from the small local library and making special trips to the butcher in town for appropriate meats. "Just stocking up," he would tell the curious butcher. "Winter's coming, you know." Tom was careful to keep Mira hidden whenever anyone visited, which wasn't often. His nearest neighbor, Bill Jacobson, lived 2 miles down the road and rarely stopped by. The weekly grocery delivery was left on his porch, and Tom made sure Mira was secured in the shed during those times. For nearly 2 months, Tom managed to keep his secret. Mira continued to grow, but her gentle nature remained unchanged. She would follow Tom around the property like a dog, keeping a respectful distance when he was working, but always within sight. At night, she still preferred to sleep inside, though she now took up considerably more space on the living room floor. Everything changed on a crisp November morning when the meat delivery truck arrived earlier than expected. Tom had just let Mira out of the shed for her morning exercise when the unfamiliar vehicle pulled up. Before he could react, Mira, likely drawn by the scent of fresh meat, charged toward the truck, breaking through the flimsy screen door of the cabin in her excitement. The delivery driver, a young man named Kyle who was substituting for the regular driver, took one look at the bear rushing toward him and let out a terrified scream. He scrambled back into his truck, locking the doors and frantically calling the sheriff's office on his cell phone. "There's a bear attacking the Henderson place," Kyle shouted into the phone. "Send help." Tom hurried after Mira, calling her name. To her credit, the young bear stopped short of the truck, more curious than aggressive. She sniffed around the vehicle, occasionally standing on her hind legs to peer through the windows at the frightened driver inside. "Mira, come here," Tom commanded firmly, and to Kyle's astonishment, the bear immediately turned and ambled back to Tom's side. By the time Sheriff Davis arrived, followed closely by half a dozen curious townspeople who had heard the emergency call on their police scanners, Tom had managed to get Mira back into the shed. But the damage was done. Word spread quickly through Cedar Lake: Tom Henderson was keeping a bear as a pet. The town council called an emergency meeting that same afternoon. Tom sat alone at the front of the community center as Mayor Wilson outlined the situation. "It has come to our attention that Mr. Henderson has been harboring a wild animal, specifically a black bear, on his property," the mayor announced to the packed room. "As you all know, this is not only illegal under state law, but potentially dangerous to our community." Tom stood to explain, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table for support. "I found her drowning in the lake, caught in a fishing net. She was just a cub, half dead. I couldn't just let her die." "No one's saying you should have left her to drown, Tom," Sheriff Davis interjected, "but you should have called Fish and Wildlife immediately." "She was too weak to be moved," Tom argued, and then, time just passed. The debate that followed was heated. Some residents, particularly those with young children, demanded that the bear be removed immediately. Others who had known Tom for decades were more sympathetic to his situation. "That bear hasn't hurt anyone," Doc Weston, the town veterinarian, pointed out. "And Tom's not some irresponsible teenager. He's a decorated veteran who's lived here his whole life." "The law is the law," countered Principal Matthews. "What kind of example are we setting if we just ignore it?" Tom listened to the arguments flying back and forth, feeling increasingly helpless. He understood their concerns, their position. He might have felt the same way. But they hadn't seen Mira's eyes that first night, hadn't felt her head resting trustingly on their leg, hadn't experienced the quiet companionship she offered during the long, lonely nights. As the meeting continued, the community center door swung open, and a tall woman with auburn hair streaked with gray stepped inside. Tom's heart sank as he recognized his daughter, Emily. Emily Henderson had left Cedar Lake 15 years ago to pursue a career in wildlife veterinary medicine in Seattle. Her visits home had become increasingly rare after Margaret's death, the gulf between father and daughter widening with each passing year. Tom hadn't even told her about Mira, knowing she would disapprove. "Dad," Emily said, her voice carrying across the now silent room as she approached him. "Mrs. Finch called me." "What were you thinking?" Tom met his daughter's gaze, seeing in it the same stubborn determination that Margaret had always said Emily inherited from him. "I was thinking about saving a life," he said simply. Emily's expression softened slightly, but her professional concern remained evident. "Bears aren't pets, Dad. They're wild animals with specific needs and instincts. Even if this one seems tame now, that could change in an instant." Tom knew she was right. Emily had once been one of the top wildlife rehabilitation veterinarians in the Pacific Northwest, before an incident 3 years ago, the same year Margaret died, had caused her to abandon her career. She had never shared the details with Tom, but he had gathered it involved a failed attempt to save a wounded animal. "I know what she is," Tom said quietly. "But she's different. And if you could just see her—" "That's exactly what I intend to do," Emily interrupted. She turned to address the room. As a licensed wildlife veterinarian, I can assess the animal's condition and behavior. Until then, I suggest we postpone any decisions." Mayor Wilson, clearly relieved to have an expert present, quickly agreed. "We'll reconvene in 2 days. In the meantime, Sheriff Davis will remain at the Henderson property as a precaution." As the meeting broke up, Tom and Emily walked back to his truck in silence. The drive home was equally quiet, the tension between them palpable. It wasn't until they pulled up to the cabin that Emily finally spoke. "You should have called me," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "This is exactly what I'm trained to handle." "You made it pretty clear you didn't want anything to do with wild animals anymore," Tom replied, immediately regretting the harshness of his words. "I'm sorry, Em. That wasn't fair." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair, a gesture so like her mother's that it made Tom's chest ache. "No, you're right. I did walk away. But this is different." When they reached the shed, Tom hesitated before unlocking the door. "She might be a bit anxious with strangers," he warned. Emily gave him a look that was half exasperation, half amusement. "Dad, I've worked with everything from wolverines to grizzlies. I think I can handle a black bear cub." Tom opened the door slowly, calling softly to Mira. "It's okay, girl. I've brought someone to meet you." Mira emerged cautiously from the shadows, her golden eyes immediately fixing on Emily. She was now the size of a large dog, her black fur glossy and thick in preparation for winter. To Tom's relief, she showed no signs of agitation, merely curiosity, as she sniffed the air. Emily stood perfectly still, allowing the bear to become accustomed to her scent. Her professional demeanor faltered slightly as she took in the animal's condition. "She's beautiful," she murmured, "and healthy-looking." "Told you," Tom said, unable to keep the pride from his voice. What happened next took both of them by surprise. Mira approached Emily slowly, sniffed her hand, then calmly walked past her to Tom's side without hesitation. The young bear settled at his feet, resting her head on his boot as naturally as a dog might. Emily stared at the scene before her, her professional composure crumbling. Tears welled in her eyes, the first Tom had seen since Margaret's funeral. "You and she saved each other," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Didn't you?" Tom felt his own eyes grow moist as he nodded, words temporarily beyond him. In that moment, the years of distance between him and his daughter seemed to collapse, bridged by their shared understanding of the healing power of the bond between human and animal. They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing options. Emily examined Mira thoroughly, confirming what Tom already knew: the bear was in excellent health and, remarkably, showed no signs of the aggression or fear that would be expected in a wild animal. "She imprinted on you," Emily explained as they sat on the porch, watching Mira explore the yard under Sheriff Davis's watchful but increasingly relaxed supervision. "It happens sometimes with orphaned wildlife that are rescued very young. They form attachments to their human caregivers that override their natural instincts." "So what happens now?" Tom asked, dreading the answer. Emily was quiet for a moment. Normally she would be relocated to a wildlife sanctuary. She's too habituated to humans to be released into the wild. Tom's heart sank. The thought of Mira confined to an enclosure, separated from the home and routine she had come to know, was almost unbearable. But Emily continued, there might be another option. Over the next 2 days, Emily worked tirelessly, making calls to colleagues and wildlife officials. She reached out to Doc Weston, who it turned out had a son working for the Montana Department of Fish and Wildlife. Together they crafted a proposal that they presented at the reconvened town meeting. After careful evaluation, Emily addressed the crowded room, her professional confidence fully restored. "I believe that Mira the bear poses minimal risk to the community under the current circumstances. However, I also recognize the legitimate concerns raised by many of you." She outlined a compromise. Tom would be granted a special license as Mira's rehabilitation caretaker under the supervision of both Emily and the Department of Fish and Wildlife. A proper enclosure would be built on his property, meeting all state requirements for captive wildlife. Regular assessments would be conducted, and if at any point Mira showed signs of increased aggression or stress, alternative arrangements would be made. "Additionally, my home," Emily concluded, "I will be relocating back to Cedar Lake permanently to establish a small wildlife rehabilitation center focusing on injured and orphaned animals from the surrounding area." The announcement of Emily's return brought murmurs of approval from the crowd. Cedar Lake had been without a full-time veterinarian since Doc Weston had semi-retired 3 years earlier, limiting his practice to farm animals and emergencies. After much discussion and debate, the town council voted to support the proposal with the condition that Tom and Emily would host educational sessions for the local schools about wildlife safety and conservation. Mayor Wilson, sensing the shift in public opinion, was quick to frame the decision as a community-building opportunity. "Cedar Lake has always been a place where neighbors help neighbors," he declared. "Today, we're extending that spirit to include one unusual new resident." In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. What had begun as a divisive issue transformed into a unifying project for the small town. The hardware store donated materials for the new enclosure. The high school shop class, under their teachers' supervision, helped with construction. The elementary school organized a fundraiser, selling "Mira the Miracle Bear" t-shirts designed by the 4th grade art class. Even Mrs. Peterson, who had been among the most vocal opponents at the town meeting, arrived one afternoon with a cooler full of frozen venison from her husband's hunting expedition. "Waste not, want not," she said briskly to Tom, though he caught her sneaking glances at Mira, who was watching the construction work from a safe distance. Emily moved into the cabin's spare bedroom, which had stood empty since she left for college. At first, the adjustment was awkward, father and daughter navigating around years of unspoken hurts and misunderstandings. But gradually, as they worked together caring for Mira and planning the new rehabilitation center, the old wounds began to heal. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mira sprawled contentedly between their chairs. Emily finally told Tom about the incident that had caused her to abandon her career. "It was a mother bear," she said quietly. "She'd been shot by a poacher who wanted her cubs for the illegal pet trade. By the time the rangers found her, she was barely alive. I worked on her for hours, but..." Her voice trailed off. Tom reached over and took his daughter's hand. "You did everything you could." Emily nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "The cubs didn't survive either. They were too young to make it without their mother. I couldn't face another case like that. It broke something in me." "And now?" Tom asked gently. Emily looked down at Mira, who had rolled onto her back, paws in the air, completely trusting and at peace. "Now I think I'm ready to try again. Different this time, but still helping." As winter deepened into spring, Mira continued to grow and thrive. Her enclosure, which encompassed nearly an acre of wooded land behind Tom's cabin, became a point of pride for Cedar Lake. Carefully supervised educational visits were arranged for the local schools, with Emily explaining bear behavior and ecology while Tom shared the story of Mira's rescue. What struck visitors most was Mira's gentle nature. Though now nearly full-grown, she retained the same calm demeanor that had characterized her since cubhood. She would sit quietly during the presentations, occasionally approaching the fence to investigate a particularly interesting child, but never showing any signs of stress or aggression. "She's one in a million," Emily would explain to the wide-eyed students. Most bears are wild animals that need to be respected and observed from a distance. Mira is special because of her unique circumstances, but she's still a bear, not a pet. Despite this careful distinction, Mira's relationship with Tom continued to defy conventional wildlife behavior. She would greet him each morning with soft grunts of recognition, follow him around the enclosure as he performed maintenance tasks, and sometimes simply sit beside him for hours as he read or worked on small wood-carving projects. Emily's Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, meanwhile, began to take shape in a converted barn on the property. Word spread quickly, and soon she was receiving calls about injured hawks, orphaned deer fawns, and even the occasional fox or bobcat. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and for the first time in years, Emily felt a sense of purpose and belonging. As Mira's first birthday approached, or what they estimated to be her birthday based on her size when Tom found her, the town decided to celebrate. What began as a small gathering evolved into a community festival, with the mayor declaring Mira Day an official Cedar Lake holiday. Tom watched the preparations with a mixture of pride and melancholy. He knew what was coming. He and Emily had discussed it extensively with the wildlife officials. Despite Mira's unusual upbringing, she was still a wild animal. The enclosure, no matter how spacious, could never provide the life she deserved. As she matured, her natural instincts would eventually call her to a different existence, one of forests and mountains, of seasonal migrations, and someday, cubs of her own. The day after the celebration, Tom rose before dawn. He found Emily already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee. "Are you sure you want to do this alone?" she asked as he sat down across from her. Tom nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. "It needs to be just us, the way it started." They had chosen a remote area deep in the national forest, far from hunting zones and hiking trails but rich in natural food sources. The wildlife officials had approved the location, though they had wanted to be present for the release. Tom had insisted on doing it himself, and eventually, they had relented, recognizing the unique bond between man and bear. After breakfast, Tom packed the truck while Emily prepared Mira for the journey. They had been gradually acclimating her to the transport cage over several weeks, making it a positive experience with treats and familiar bedding. Even so, Tom's heart ached as he watched her enter the cage, trusting, as always, that whatever he asked of her was for her own good. The drive was long and silent. Emily had offered to come, but Tom had gently refused. This final journey was something he needed to do alone, a completion of the circle that had begun that foggy morning on Cedar Lake. When they reached the designated spot, Tom parked and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. From the back of the truck, he could hear Mira moving restlessly, perhaps sensing the unfamiliar surroundings through scent and sound. "All right, old man," Tom murmured to himself, "time to be brave one more time." He climbed out and walked around to the truck bed. Mira's golden eyes fixed on him through the cage bars, and Tom felt his resolve waver. How could he explain to her what was happening? How could he make her understand that this parting was an act of love, not abandonment. With careful movements, Tom unloaded the cage and carried it to the edge of a small clearing. All around them, the forest stretched out, ancient pines reaching skyward, underbrush teeming with life, a small stream gurgling nearby. This was the world Mira was meant to inhabit, wild and free. Tom opened the cage door and stepped back. For a long moment, Mira remained inside, her gaze shifting between Tom and the forest beyond. Then, hesitantly, she emerged, her powerful muscles rippling beneath her glossy fur as she took her first steps into her new home. She explored the clearing cautiously, sniffing at unfamiliar plants, pawing at the soft earth. Tom watched, memorizing every detail, the way the sunlight dappled her black coat, the graceful swing of her head as she surveyed her surroundings, the soft huffs of breath as she processed the myriad new scents. Finally, Mira turned back to Tom, approaching him with the same gentle demeanor she had always shown. She stopped directly in front of him, rising slightly on her hind legs to bring her face level with his. Tom remained perfectly still as she sniffed his face, her warm breath tickling his skin. "This is goodbye, Mira," Tom whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You be good out here. You be strong." As if understanding, Mira dropped back to all fours and placed one massive paw on Tom's hand, leaving a muddy print, an unintentional mark that felt like a deliberate signature. Then she turned and walked toward the forest's edge. At the boundary between clearing and wilderness, she paused, looking back one last time, her golden eyes meeting Tom's across the distance. In that gaze was everything they had shared, the rescue, the healing, the quiet companionship that had pulled Tom back from the brink of despair after Margaret's death. Then, with a soft grunt that might have been farewell, Mira disappeared into the shadows of the forest. Tom stood motionless for a long time, the empty cage beside him, the muddy paw print on his hand slowly drying in the sun. He had expected to feel emptiness, the same hollow ache that had followed him since Margaret's passing. Instead, he felt a curious peace, a sense of completion rather than loss. The story of Tom Henderson and the bear he saved spread beyond Cedar Lake in the months that followed. A reporter from the state newspaper wrote a feature that was picked up by national outlets. Wildlife conservation groups reached out to Emily's new rehabilitation center, offering support and resources. Tom found himself reluctantly famous, receiving letters from across the country from people touched by his act of compassion. Life settled into a new rhythm. Emily's center flourished, attracting interns and volunteers. Tom, at her insistence, became involved in the educational programs, discovering a talent for storytelling as he recounted Mira's rescue to wide-eyed children and adults alike. In the evenings, Tom would often sit on his porch, gazing toward the distant mountains where Mira now roamed. Sometimes he imagined he could see a dark shape moving among the trees, golden eyes gleaming in the twilight. Whether real or imagined, the vision brought him comfort. 1 year after Mira's release, Tom received a call from a forest ranger he had befriended during the preparations for Mira's return to the wild. "Thought you'd want to know," the ranger said. "We've been tracking a female black bear in the release area, likely your Mira based on the location and age. She's healthy, established a good territory, and Tom, she's not alone. Spotted her with 2 cubs last week." That night, Tom sat on his porch longer than usual, Emily beside him in comfortable silence as the stars emerged above the Montana mountains. He thought about the interconnected journeys that had brought them all to this moment, himself, Emily, and Mira, each broken in their own way, each healing through an unexpected bond. "Do you think she remembers us?" Emily asked softly, as if reading his thoughts. Tom smiled, looking down at his hand where the memory of a muddy paw print still lingered, invisible to the eye but indelible in his heart. "I think some connections don't need remembering," he replied. "They just are." In the distance, a bear called to her cubs, the sound carrying across the valley like a reminder that even in the wildest places, love remains the greatest miracle of all.